This video is about evaluating arguments, finding gaps between the premises and the conclusion, and figuring out what premises or assumptions are implied but unstated that would fill in that gap. And it's a bit of an art form in a way. This can be a tricky practice. Okay, but let's consider this argument. Okay, I know nothing about the external world because my senses have deceived me. For anyone who's studied philosophy, you might recognize this argument as coming from the modern philosopher René Descartes. Okay, so the first thing we would need to do is to identify what the conclusion is versus what the premise or premises are. The word because is a premise indicator. So really the premise of the argument is this: my senses have deceived me. And then the conclusion is this first part: I know nothing about the external world. Okay. Now, so this is the argument, but when evaluating it, it seems like it's a bit of a leap. You go from the fact that your senses deceive you to suddenly knowing nothing about the external world. It seems like there's some kind of gap there that is implied but not stated that we could insert to help us kind of go from that premise to the conclusion. We need some kind of a bridge that would lead us from the premise to the conclusion. So what is being assumed here exactly? Premise one is just about a kind of source of knowledge, the senses, and the conclusion is about knowledge of the external world and my lack of it. Okay, so it seems like the arguer is really saying that if there is knowledge of the external world, it must come to us via the senses, and the senses can't deceive us about that. Okay, that is all implied in this argument. Okay, obviously, if the senses deceiving you makes it so you know nothing about the external world, there can be no additional source of knowledge about the external world. It must all depend on your senses. So that's one thing that we can add to this that seems to be implied here, is that any knowledge of the external world must come from reliable sense data. Okay, and that is not stated in the argument, but it certainly is implied, because this is why we would rule out some knowledge of the external world coming from some other source beyond the senses. Okay, and it kind of creates a bridge going from premise one to the conclusion that we have to assume to accept this conclusion. Okay, so now consider the argument with this added premise in here. My senses have deceived me. Any knowledge of the external world must come from reliable sense data. Okay, which turns out we don't have. We have no reliable sense data because our senses can be deceiving. So that would infer that we know nothing about the external world. Okay, so it can be a bit tricky to figure out what that implied premise is, but it needs to be there to lead you from what's given in the argument to what is argued for, the conclusion. All right. Okay, well, I want to give you a couple other examples, and I think these examples might be in a way easier. They come from moral arguments. Okay, let's consider two arguments on the topic of abortion, a highly controversial topic. Okay, let's consider the first one. It says abortion is wrong because it violates a person's right to life. Okay. So we want to find the premise versus the conclusion. We see that word because, it's a premise indicator. So we can identify this last part of the passage as the premise. Okay. Essentially, abortion violates a person's right to life. And then the conclusion is abortion is wrong. Well, there's a couple unstated reasons, I think, that are needed that I think the arguer would just be assuming that would lead us from the premises to the conclusion. One is that the premise just comments on rights, what abortion does. It violates a person's right to life. All right. And then the conclusion weighs in on what's right and wrong. All right. So one thing that is unstated but seems to be clearly implied here is that violating a person's right to life is wrong. And now we have a bridge. We have violating a person's right to life established in premise 1, and we have the wrongness of that established in premise 2, and that creates the bridge that's needed to infer the conclusion. But I would also say that premise 1 is highly controversial here. Okay, abortion violates a person's right to life, and this argument essentially kind of begs the question, like, why should I accept premise 1? And the question we want to ask here is what's assumed in this argument, that's kind of packed into premise 1 that isn't stated, but is assumed by the arguer. And that would be this additional premise that a fetus is a person with a right to life. Okay. And that creates a bridge as well to understanding how it is that abortion violates a person's right to life. Abortion destroys a fetus, so we have to be assuming there that a fetus is a person with a right to life, which is a highly controversial claim. Okay, but these two premises here are, I think we can reasonably say they were assumed in the argument from the get-go, and they're needed to bring us from that reason that is provided, that abortion violates a person's right to life. They need to be inserted to create the bridge that brings us to the wrongness of abortion. Okay. Now let's consider a counter argument that will look very similar here. Okay. So the counter argument would be abortion is not wrong because it does not violate a person's right to life. Okay, there's a common counter argument. We see the word because, so we know where the premise is. Okay, so the premise can be articulated as abortion does not violate a person's right to life. And then our conclusion is that abortion is not wrong. And again, we have a premise that just kind of says something about people and their right to life, and that abortion does not violate any person's right to life. And then the conclusion comments on the moral permissibility of abortion, that it's not wrong. So we have like a moral claim, like a moral judgment for the conclusion, and a comment about rights in premise one. So we need some kind of bridge to bring us from the premise to the conclusion. Okay, so one thing that seems to be implied here is actually that violating a person's right to life is wrong. And I say that that's implied here because the arguer is making a point of saying that no person's right to life was violated, meaning that that seems to be of importance. Okay, so I think there would be agreement between the first arguer and this counter arguer over the idea that violating a person's right to life is wrong. But the key sticking point is that this arguer does not believe that abortion does that. Okay, so that leads us to this other assumed premise that a fetus is not a person with a right to life. So this counter argument is not suggesting that it's morally acceptable to violate people's rights to life. Okay, but it is the fundamental disagreement is over the personhood of the fetus. And that's, I think, where the core disagreement is between the person making the previous argument and the person making this argument, is over whether we are dealing with a person with a right to life. But premise two would be something that I think both sides would agree on. Okay, the key disagreement is really with premise one, founded in a core disagreement with premise three. Okay, but the key takeaway here is not to concern ourselves with the morality of abortion. That's, of course, a key moral concern. But as critical thinkers, we want to take the premises that are given, see whether they provide all the information needed to kind of bridge, to create a bridge between them and the conclusion, to really articulate an inference. And if something's missing, if there's a bit of a leap that is being made in the argument, to try to figure out what the person seems to be assuming in order to take that premise and derive that conclusion. And whatever those assumptions are, articulate them in additional premises. Any added premise will be just a complete statement that's true or false that helps bring us from the existing premise or premises to the conclusion that's being inferred.